that, well, it's not enough to just make our record. You have to go sell our record. And either both of them or one of them thought it was you, but neither was sure. So I don't know if that sounds like you or if you remember doing that.
It's so long ago, I have no specific recollection. Hold on a second.
Yeah, sure. It sounds like sounds like you, though, at least.
That kind of thing maybe I could have said, or that might have been why, we might have, I simply can't recall, and I don't remember having real nasty discussions about it, like, you're an idiot, I hate you, I can't trust you, but it was sort of uncomfortable, as I recall.
Yeah.
Because one part was that I just I felt awkward to even reveal to them that I was going down to New York and doing this, because, we had been helped out a lot by the Alliance, and I was, embarrassed to be acting interested in jumping ship,
Mm-hmm.
That happens a lot in the music business. People jump labels, people jump agents, do that all the time, and then naturally there's discomfort, or people quit bands and start other bands.
Right.
It's just done all the time. Loyalties shift, and in retrospect, what I was doing, who could really blame me? Because we're talking about major labels and money and careers and stuff, and they weren't in a position to do anything for us like RCA Records or Warner Brothers could have done for us. And I actually was getting to sit in the office with these people. They were interested enough to not just turn me down and say, get lost, So I was kind of enticed. I thought out of that many labels who were talking to me, one of them would make us an offer.
Right.
It seemed logical. I had some friends who I used to play with called High Country in California that were signed to Warner Brothers.
Yeah.
On the label of one of the rock stars who had taken an interest in them.
Mm-hmm.
So I really felt like I was helping my band and everything, but I didn't want to tell Rounder, those first few cuts that we recorded for the next Rounder record, I'm in New York with us now. But if we ever had a discussion and they said, we felt a little bad about that, then my obvious answer would have been, well, I would have thought that these people could help us in a bigger way than you could help us, and that's
Right.
why I did it, And, sure enough, though, went back to Rounder. They put the thing out. Barrel of Fun had a very unusual cover, which reflected where we were at sort of artistically, which is now we had, instead of a fairly intense-looking, solemn group of guys standing out in the field with their instruments, on the front cover, we were not holding our instruments, but we were depicted in a chorus line, kicking our feet up in the air, with some really long-haired guys in the chorus line with, arms over each other's shoulders, and a scene that would be very common in a hippie, love-in kind of thing.
Sure.
Whatever, it was always called a be-in, a love-in.
Yeah.
That was a real commonplace around colleges, but anybody from the standard bluegrass audience looking at us must have thought, oh no, invasion of the freaks, and that was during the height of the Vietnam, tearing the country apart kind of stuff, and
Right.
colleges being shut down by people who looked like that, setting fires in the street and calling off classes and stuff, and it was very touchy to be acting like this. And on the back cover, we also had a kind of a humorous thing, and all the pictures we took, in the photo session were all like satirical pictures. None of us acting solemn about our music. Andy had a lot to do with that because he was very funny and was always getting us to be, weird, and so, his saxophone on the record and his attitude really permeated that, and we kind of took a major left turn, and the second record didn't sell as well as the first record, and it was not easily embraced. There was a lot more diverse stuff in it. The first one was a more unified kind of record. The second one was more of a hodgepodge, saying, well, now that we've got your attention, we're going to abuse it.
Right.
And there's still some great stuff on there I'm extremely proud of, but it was not like Kentucky Bullfight, for instance.
Yeah.
But it was a more uneven kind of thing, you might say. And we also had the advantage of multi-track recording, so that you could take out something and redo it, and we would put in a solo that worked okay, but didn't work. It didn't sound good with the accompaniment that had been recorded on the first solo.
Yeah.
In other words, we were just new to the multi-track stuff that we made. It didn't have the cohesion that record of all,
Right.
all played and done at the same time would have.
Along these lines you've been saying, you wrote what is still to me an interesting letter to Bluegrass Unlimited years earlier. In fact, within the magazine's first year, and you talked about cultural differences between New Yorkers and the Southerners who...
I have no recollection of even writing that letter.
Okay, well, you said the difficulty, something along the lines of the biggest difficulties you feel within the bluegrass field are cultural differences between New Yorkers and the Southerners who created and perpetuated the music in the South. And then you went on to say that those in the city either feel the music is too simple erroneously, or else they feel compelled to subject to a level of intellectual analysis and write about it to an extent that you're going to put off any Southern music listener. And you concluded by telling everybody to forget your damn cultural frame of reference. It was a...
I think I'd still stick by that.
Do you think it still exists out there in the...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's... America, in some ways, has become something more of a melting pot than, a regional dominated culture, I mean, everything from, the fact that, you can have some of the bigger bluegrass festivals are in the north now, and in California, and places like that, and then when you go south, people are playing just standard pop music, and the announcers on the radio stations don't have Southern accents.
Right.
There's a certain kind of, mass culturalism, and then bluegrass, of course, is way down low on the priority list and is under the radar of that national culture, and yet it turns out it's possible for somebody in Sacramento, California, to have been playing bluegrass for 30 years and to know more about bluegrass than somebody in Virginia knows, because they've been following the records. They've gone south a few times. The Southern artists have come out there, and they just adapted it, and Mike Seeger is probably the leading example of a person who, even though he was raised in a sort of an academic family, he made the choice to be a member of the hillbilly music culture.
Right.
And even though he brought things to it that are not of that culture, he was very comfortable to learn all kinds of tunes, get to know all kinds of people. His way of talking probably changed a little bit so that it would go down easier and not be so remarkably different sounding. A guy from New York, I hear myself interviewing guys like Jimmy Martin, and it really sounds like Yankee meets Southerner. I probably my speech patterns when I'm in the bluegrass context probably have been modified somewhat. Just not that I take on a Southern accent, but I'm less pronounced. I'm less likely to use large words and things like that to try to blend a little bit better. And people do that. And then I write songs that are valid bluegrass songs. I mean, I wrote a song in my own words that Del McCurry recorded, and other songs that have been bluegrass hit songs, even, because I'm enough tuned into what bluegrass is about so that I can very naturally be right in that mode and play in that mode. And then at the same time, somebody who's playing with Bill Monroe might also be a school teacher, and know more about more stuff than the guys who played with Monroe in the 50s.
Right.
I mean, somebody like Tom Ewing, for instance, is a bit of a scholar and not just a guy who, Tom Ewing.
I know who he is, yeah. And I don't know him. I know who he is.
Well, he's one of these guys who, he's a scholar, and yet he fit right into the bluegrass boys.
Right.
And there's a fair amount of that kind of stuff. So it's not, when Platt and Scruggs came to Carnegie Hall, I really felt like we were being visited in York, downtown New York, by a tribe of people who just didn't know anything about our ways, and we didn't know anything about their ways. And it was like when the Moiseev ballet from Russia came to America. It's like, wow, they all dress different from us, and they talk different from us, and they're just so different, you know.
Right.
You know, once the bands abandoned the string ties and the cowboy hats, and a band like Third Time Out, for instance, or Blue Highway, they look like everybody. You know, they look like somebody, you know, shopping at Kmart in any Kmart in the whole country.
Right.
Whereas Earl Scruggs on stage at Carnegie Hall had a white cowboy hat and a string tie, and he was dressed in a suit, you know.
Yeah.
And they were much more pronounced about, you know, we are different. We are from this other realm, and I kind of miss that. In fact, I really like having, you know, the mystery of a visiting foreign culture. and when people were giving up the hats, you could hardly find, you know, so we're down to Ralph Stanley pretty much, you know,
Yeah.
and a few younger retro bands who are wearing hats, but the hats have gone away, you know, and it really makes a different thing. So,
well, you know, and I don't know if it was the Times or the Post, but a columnist for one of the major New York papers referred to the Flatt and Scruggs concert at Carnegie as an invasion of the Hicks from the Sticks. In fact, I think
I didn't know that, but, well, you know, to some extent that, you know, that would be a very common attitude
Yeah.
in New York. You know, that was still, that concert was pre-Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
you know, and pre-Joan Baez, really. You know, that was a very early bit of folk musicians, as they were called, coming
Right.
north, and it was much more dramatic at the time than than it's easily appreciated now. They just didn't make that many trips that far north, or if they did, it was to like a country music park in Pennsylvania, where, you know, there was still a very country feel. I mean, a lot of my friends in New York City and I would travel to Sunset Park down near Philadelphia, but it's kind of in the sticks, and there'd be people chewing tobacco, and you know, and you know, what was being served for cuisine was not the kind of stuff you'd get in New York City. It was the kind of stuff you'd get, you know, in the rural parts of the South, and it was like a lot of them were transplanted Southerners anyway.
Right.
So there was, at that time, there was this very strong cultural difference. During the Vietnam War, when New Yorkers, scruffy-looking New Yorkers, went to bluegrass festivals in the South, they really stuck out. And they were mostly welcomed because they were peaceful, and they weren't there to be boisterous, and they actually, a lot of them could play well, you know. And in the 60s, a number of bands from the New York City area went down and won major prizes at Union Grove in North Carolina.
Right.
And they were treated real well, and they were kind of amazed that kids that could look like that could play that well.
Right.
And that was some of the important first, you know, sort of universalizing factors in bluegrass, when Bill Monroe and others caught on to the fact that these weren't just fans of the music; these were musicians who were going to be important in the future, who were showing up in their midst and wanting to learn and exchange, and bluegrass became not so much of a regional thing anymore as a national and turned out international thing. When I started traveling in the, say, early 80s with Hot Rise and started running into people in Sweden and Australia and Finland who could play really well. I mean, they weren't just pretty good, they were great. You know? They weren't just good for foreigners, they were just good.
Right.
And of course, there was always the problem of what's going to happen when they start to sing, you know, which has always been a problem for, you know, the musicians not from this country. But
Right.
nevertheless, it proved quite clearly that bluegrass was no longer merely a regional kind of music, and if a band wanted to do well, they should at least take into account that there's people on the West Coast and in the North who would pay good money to hear them.
Yeah.
And it expanded their market, and on one hand they liked the charm and how regional they could act. Like the Dillards got, you know, traded handsomely on the fact that they were Hicks from the Sticks. But they also traded handsomely on the fact that one of them could really talk in a way that would make urban audiences laugh. And the Greenbrier Boys was another band like that from New York City, that they did the music also had a way of appealing to the urban audience, and any bands like the Country Gentlemen, who were more or less, they weren't a true Southern band, they were a Washington D.C. band, but they also they got traded a lot on the fact that they could be humorous, not in the Flat and Scruggs hee-haw sort of way, but in the more urbane sort of manner of being humorous. And so all those barriers started not melting entirely, but they started shifting, and instead of a wall over your head between you and the other culture, there was more like a fence that you could, with a gate that you could walk through.
Did the musicians tend to not care, more than the audience? Did the musicians tend to not care about these cultural differences if they met people who could play, as you said earlier?
I think it was on a case-by-case basis. There would be some straight country guys who, if some good singing and playing younger person with long hair came up and started playing with them, they would be ready to flee.
Yeah.
And there was guys like that from the South, like the New Deal String Band, which had hugely long hair, or the Bluegrass Alliance, which later evolved into the Newgrass Revival, which were people with very long hair. There were Southern hippies in the mid-'70s, or even in the early '70s, people with long hair who listened to rock music, who still played bluegrass. Like Sam Bush, their first record was 1971, and they had long hair, and they did Prince of Peace, which that Leon Russell tune or somebody. Anyway, and they would go up, they would play at their local bluegrass festivals and scare the local guys with the short hair and the cowboy hats.
Right.
And so it wasn't merely the guys coming down from New York.
Yeah.
But there was all of that, and when me and Russ and John from Country Cooking went down to Union Grove, we got into some jam sessions with some Southern guys who were straight, and one of them, Jerry Stewart, we used one of his tunes on the first Country Cooking record, and he wasn't uptight about the cultural differences, but one landmark thing that happened was in 1973 or so, or a couple of landmark things. In '72, I think, Country Cooking played a festival that was sort of where Bill Monroe was sort of one of those proprietors of the festival. He kind of teamed up with local people to present a festival. And by this time, Russ had really long hair, almost down to his waist. And this would be about '73. Anyway, I was told by Carlton Haney, who was the guy who started bluegrass festivals, and to be sort of one of my informants about what their culture was all about. I would hang around and talk with him for hours about what bluegrass is really all about and stuff. And when he heard we were going to play this Bill Monroe festival with Russ looking like that, he said, "Monroe won't even look at you. He doesn't realize this, and when he sees you, he's just going to avoid you." So we played our set, and Russ was playing mandolin, actually, because I was usually the guitar player in those situations. And right after our set, Monroe came right up to Russ and said, "Keep playing those new notes."
Those new notes?
New notes. That was the quote. And that kind of flipped us all out, that Monroe was not just not avoiding us, he was going right up to the worst offender in terms of appearance and respecting his music. And we thought that was very hip indeed.
Right.
And then we played that festival again. We had different people in the festival, and this particular festival, it was really hot, 100 degrees, and I did what I always did in a situation like that with people, which was wear shorts, and I wore shorts on stage. And Ken Irwin, who was at that festival, was in Delaware, came up to me later and said, "Man, that is a real mistake wearing shorts, And I said, "Man, it's hot, what do you think I am?" I was very offended that he would be offended. And he says, "Well, there's a lot of people in this audience who don't like seeing a guy on stage wearing shorts." And I said, "Oh, come on. Bring me one of them, and I'd like to hear what he has to say." So Ken says, "I will." So about 2 minutes later, here comes Ken with this, older dude, with a baseball hat on, and, And he didn't wait for me to introduce myself. He just started saying to me, "I don't come here to see some guy up with." He said exactly what Ken said, you know. And I went, duh.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I'd been used to, you know, I competed in a banjo contest once in the north, you know, wearing shorts, and people kind of made fun of me a little bit. But I thought, well, get over it, you know. But here, I'm a visitor in their territory, sort of, and I was told I was misbehaving, and that was the very last time I ever wore shorts on stage. And now there's even people who will do that, and I won't, you know.
Yeah.
Because I felt Ken really taught me something, you know, and we've had this interesting, you know, both of us will criticize, me and Ken will continue to criticize each other over, you know, what we perceive as misbehavior, and both of us listen to the other guy, even though we have a certain amount of friction over this, but we respect each other enough so that we will hear the other one out, and both of us have had the pleasure of seeing the other person change their behavior after being brought up short, you know, by the other guy. So I really value Ken in that way. There's not many people who would have the nerve to criticize me and besides that have good points to make that I should have known in the first place, you know. And I still stumble, even at the age of 54. I will still stumble on cultural differences and being naive about the way I'm being perceived by other people, and you know, trying to fit better. There's always you know, the protocols between the Southern culture and the manners that are practiced by the Southern culture are, as opposed to the confrontational, the willing to be confrontational aspect of the non-Southern culture. You know, those clash. You know, and there are times that I'd be critical or even sarcastic about something where people just think that's an awful infraction. And I've been very proud that I've been able to stay president of the IBMA for as long as I have, and not have people get the idiot Yankee out of there.
Cannibalize you.
I've learned how to keep my manners in check, and I do think it's a nicer way to behave, you know. And I've laid off a lot of my New York style upbringing in favor of the bluegrass sort of way of behaving,
right?
For I think good reason. Let me grab this and I'll be right back.
Thank you.
I'm already quaking a little bit about imagining me seeing myself yak on about that kind of stuff in print.
Well, let me shift it a little bit then. I mean, not a whole lot, but what do you think was you know, one of Rounder's biggest bands, I guess, or longest running bands, was the JMB, you know, hailed as the new traditionalism. What do you think was the appeal of that coming when it did in around 1980 or so? Why? And this was a DC band. This was a DC band, not really a deep Southern band. And
we would start. Hot Rise was, you know,
you were kind of contemporaries.
We would start hearing about the Johnson Mountain Boys, and people say, "Oh, they just play traditional, but they're so good," you know. And we think, how good could they be? You know? And we finally heard them, and you know, they were tight, and they had a good lead singer, and the guy who played banjo, Richard Underwood, really seemed to know exactly what not to play, which hardly anybody can do. It's very strong. It's an amazing skill. Absolutely not deviating from what you should play, and never playing what you should not play. To be within a certain style, and they really had it down, and their attitude was good. The way they dressed and everything, the way they rushed on stage, and it was cool. And we got to play a festival with them and kind of bonded with them almost immediately. And at the time, I was doing interviews with a lot of singers, partly so that it could be played on a radio show I was affiliated with in Denver, but also with the eye toward eventually having interviews about singing in a songbook. I had already done that once. You know, I'd interviewed a bunch of people like Lester Flatt, you know, Pete Rowan, and a lot of the earlier round of great singers. And now there was a bunch of people I wanted to interview who were from a later generation, and I interviewed Dudley. Yeah. And within that interview, you know, I said, you know, it's kind of interesting. You know, we sort of thought you'd be real kind of straight hick sort of guys, and look at you. guys are all wearing sunglasses and shorts between sets.
Right.
And then you get decked out in the suits and the hats on stage. And he says, yeah, people call me Clark, like Clark Kent, because I changed my identity so dramatically. And we used to marvel at how the Johnson Mountain Boys could be sitting in the second row or could be mingling in the crowd and nobody would recognize them because, you know, Dave McLaughlin's wearing sort of a fishnet tank top, you know, and then he gets decked out like, you know, a member of the Clinch Mountain Boys, and nobody knows it's the same person, you know, and we used to be kind of amazed by that. But they had, you know, they had really done that Mike Seeger thing I was talking about, which is, and Mike Seeger says, hey, if you grew up on a farm in Tennessee and you want to be an opera singer in New York City, they let you. So why can't it work the other way around, you know?
Yeah.
If you do the work. And they had obviously done the work.
Well, Dudley had told, I asked Dudley about their visual images, and I interviewed him fairly recently, a couple of months ago, and I was surprised, actually, when he told me that they consciously looked at printed material.
Yeah.
Album jackets and magazines, and they loved collecting that stuff, he said, because they were so into history. And that, to be honest with you, would kind of throw me for a loop. Here's the great hero of the traditionalist movement in the last 20 years.
He's a suburban guy. A lot of people catch on to that because they didn't project anything but, you know, what they were trying to project. But these were suburban guys who did not grow up on farms, you know. Hardly any of the stars of the second generation of bluegrass grew up on a farm, and all of the ones from the first generation did grow up on a farm.
Now, if people picked that up, you say people didn't pick that up, they just kind of looked at them and listened to them and enjoyed the show.
Yeah.
Would there have been the kind of resentment that there might have been for, say, hippies or something?
No,
Poseurs?
No, I mean, you know...
Rip-offs, people taking what's not there?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think an awful lot is in the presentation, you know, and if you dress right and talk right and act right among people who are sensitive to that stuff, you know, if they find out that you grew up in suburbia, they might not feel the same about you as when they say, what kind of farm did your family do?
Right.
And you said oats and hay. You know, and the other person said, well, actually, my father was a math teacher.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
And, you know, they would take a little while longer, but then if you say, well, let's do that Reno and Smiley thing, you know, from the, you know, that record, not the later one that's not good, the early one, you know.
Yeah.
Now you're talking their language, and if it's between musicians, it works. I found that even the scruffy-looking hippies at the festivals in the late 60s, while, you know, I mean, I went from the Democratic National Convention in 1968, where there was all that culture clash going on with the cops beating up the kids and everything. I went right from there directly to a bluegrass festival in Virginia without going home first. Talk about your culture clash. And there in the parking lot, you know, I was hanging out with people who would have my head for my political beliefs, but I didn't discuss my political beliefs. And we would just share what we were cooking on our Coleman stoves and hang out and pick, you know. And I thought that was a wonderful respite from the country being torn apart.
Sure.
And I would ignore the Wallace bumper stickers in the parking lot, and I would ignore the occasional racial joke on stage.
Yeah.
It would make me squirm, but I thought, well, these people are on to something that I do still want to be part of, even though they're not very tuned into things I wish they were.
Right.
And then you'd find out that some of them were, especially when you come across some of the younger musicians who, would be wanting, to indulge in some of the pleasures they associated with northern college kids and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, there was like I said, instead of being a wall, like here's this tribe arriving on Carnegie Hall stage, from another planet, more like a fence that did have gates that you could walk through, and people did.
Apart from your personal camaraderie with the members of the JMB when you'd encounter them, did you find at times that the public would set you guys up as opposite ends of the continuum?
No, because we were doing something similar to them. We were on the forefront like they were, we were wearing suits on stage.
Yeah.
We named ourselves after an element of Flat and Scruggs feel.
Right.
And then we did material that we had a few kind of new grassy things, like we did Wichita Lineman, bluegrass style. We did some other things that had more chords. They were more like country cooking style instrumentals with 6 chords rather than, we weren't trying to play jazz, but this was an expanded form of bluegrass. But then we had lead singer Tim, who he could play, some people considered us a traditional bluegrass band because of the way Tim could sing.
Right.
And we did a lot of songs that just had 2 chords or 3 chords, and we covered Flat and Scruggs and Monroe stuff as well as we could. And then our originals were not, let's boogie, up on the hill where they do the boogie, but our originals were like Nellie Kane, which was a traditional sounding song. And in fact, we were amazed when Ralph Stanley actually covered a Hot Rize song and thought it was a traditional song, and the album cover called it traditional. and just the idea that he even record a Hot Rize song was cool, but the fact that we fooled him into thinking that this is an old song and it was written by Tim and Nick, that kind of was a little bit of a thrill,
Yeah.
So some people considered us a modern band, some people considered us a traditional band, and we liked that because, in fact, the Johnson Mountain Boys kind of wrote off all the more modern end of bluegrass, and if you didn't like your bluegrass hard and straight, the Johnson Mountain Boys would not
Appeal to you, right?
They wouldn't please you as much. So there's the modern end of bluegrass that they missed out on catching that market.
Right.
And yet we try to play our cards just right so that we wouldn't offend the traditionalists and we would still be interesting to the more modern end of people. And then having a lot of humor in our show.
Right.
Seemed to sell things all over the place, and we were actually supporting ourselves. By the end of Hot Rize, we actually made enough money to live on as bluegrass musicians, which hasn't been done by many people before. I always thought that was quite an accomplishment, and it was always sad to me that a band as great as the Johnson Mountain Boys, or on the other side of the spectrum, Skyline, which was also phenomenally talented people who were completely off the map as far as the traditionalists were concerned. Both bands broke up about the same year,
right?
And financial considerations were part of the scene with both. If they had been scoring more heavily and making more money, they could have stayed in the business, but they both, disbanded, and that was a sorrowful thing to me. And everybody grieved, especially the JMB,
Yeah.
But a lot of people grieved Skyline too, and I thought it was really a shame that you had to be a centrist to be able to survive,
Sounds like politics.
Sounds a lot like politics.
Yeah.
If the field were bigger, that was one thing that made me say that IBMA has got to weigh in there and really grow the entire boat, so that if you're only reaching 60% of the bluegrass crowd because your style is not centrist, that's still enough to live on.
Yeah.
Because JMB and Skyline we're getting something like 60 or 80% of the bluegrass crowd, and they needed to get 100% to stay together, and the bluegrass scene is not big enough to support them, unfortunately. Maybe now it would be, but back then it was there was that's still that gap, and there really still is. I mean,
That was only 12 years ago or so.
Yeah, well, it's still hard to support yourself full-time as a bluegrass act, but there are more people who do that at this point.
Do you recall the Rounder press release announcing the JMB breakup? It made a big splash.
Well. I was...
Some of it seemed that Hot Rods could have been very offended by that, in fact, if they wanted to be.
Well, I was personally offended. That press release, had a bunch of sort of hastily said things. Ken told me later that he will never, ever let out a press release I think somebody read it to him over the phone and he said, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And later he really regretted that press release because it expressed too much disappointment in things that, were trying their best, so to speak.
Yeah.
And they ignored certain realities. I mean, Johnson Mountain Boys broke up, but Hot Rise didn't have to break up.
Sure.
And it's because we were centrists. So
Yeah.
what really pissed me off about that was that it got Richard Harrington of the Washington Post cranked up into writing this enormous, huge article in the Washington Post.
Yeah, I've read that.
I mean, that article offended me. I can't tell you how much it offended me because they never gave us attention of that level in bluegrass except when they thought we were dying.
Yeah.
They said, now we'll talk about you now and we'll announce to the world that you're dead. And I thought, fuck you, bud. You don't have to say that in the print,
Okay.
You haven't been around to where I've been around, and in fact, they were quoting musicians who hadn't been out to the West Coast and seen little kids. Like I'd seen Chris Thiele, who was at the age of 7, playing incredible mandolin. And I'd seen festivals that were overrun by children on the West Coast.
Yeah.
And I knew there was great musicians on the way up, and there was a market for bluegrass amongst young families if the festival people and the artists would only dial into that a little bit. It was already happening out west. It wasn't no secret, and there was even some of that happening in small pockets around the east. But here are people saying, "Oh no, it's all old people, and they're all dying, and it's all over." And,
Right.
And I thought that is incorrect. It is totally detrimental to our scene. My sociology training included the concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And I didn't like the authority of the Washington Post pronouncing us dead because it would help us die if everybody believed it. And so I immediately wrote a big letter to Richard Harrington, which was never printed or even answered by Richard Harrington. I was already the president of the IBMA, so I thought it was really inappropriate that he didn't even acknowledge my letter
Right.
and say just anything, but he never even wrote me back. So I also sent that same letter to Bluegrass Unlimited, which printed it in its entirety. And I lambasted, the conclusions that had been reached, and I also gave my data, for how if we would just dial into younger people, they're already out there appreciating us, and we could get more of them on board.
Right.
And the festivals need to open up a little bit and not be so boring and some things like that. There's ways of making this music much more appealing to more people without changing its essential character. And if and Hot Rise, I said, is doing okay, and it's partly because we know we have a good combination of elements that work for us commercially, including the fact that we make a point of appealing to the center. I think I said that. And then I said it's just too bad that some people feel like they have to bail.
Yeah.
And if they think they'll be happier doing something else, okay. But I knew in my heart that the Johnson Mountain Boys would not really stay down. And in fact, a year later, I called Dudley and I said, "I bet you're going crazy. You haven't played any bluegrass gigs lately." He said, "You're right. I'm going crazy." I said, "Well, right. I just came from a festival where if you guys had all just happened to show up and jumped on stage, everybody would have gone bananas. Why can't you just do that once in a while,
Right.
And they'd probably pay you good money to do it." So a year later, the Johnson Mountain Boys are getting big money from playing reunion gigs.
Yeah.
And I felt kind of proud that I had kicked, I was probably one of many people who told Dudley you ought to do this, but I felt kind of proud that, that I think it sounded, the way you talked to me, like nobody had presented the idea yet.
Right.
But people loved them, and we're so happy to see them back playing together again. And they did that for a number of years before it fully, died out.
Sure. Well, Dudley's in about 3 aggregations now or something.
Well, yeah, he is now, and at that time, there was other things pulling on them, and once they were no longer a full-time band, they didn't have the same glue keeping them together and being who they were the way they did when they just spent every waking moment together, traveling, doing all that stuff. There's a stress, but you also bond in a certain way that makes you sort of more invulnerable. And when they became a band that was only playing occasional Saturday nights at different places, you know, it led to, you know, the final breakup, especially when Eddie got to work down at the Opry and all that, WSM.
Yeah, it's a whole other type of gig.
And Dudley had to have a job, and after a while they were just sort of distracted enough so that it was harder to keep the JMB together. But it still, you know, it gave them a much more dignified way to exit, you know, a nicer way to exit than just saying, we can't take it anymore.
Yeah.
You know, that was a terrible, you know, they didn't mean it this way at all. But one of the things, I in my letter to BU, I said this is a lot like when the valedictorian of the high school graduating class committed suicide. It actually just happened out here, here in Colorado, and everybody was just stunned. They said, but we loved him. Why would he do this? You know, and not just to himself, but he did it to all of them because the person who was carrying the banner just says, I can't do this anymore. I'm not happy doing this. You know.
Yeah.
And they were. It was understandable. They were being overworked. You know. They were being booked in places where the travel time was too much, and they were, by the end of that summer, they were just cooked, and that will happen to anybody, and they just needed some time off before they kind of improved their attitude. But when they laid down the thing saying, this is too hard, we can't make it, you know, all the people who believed in them it was like stabbing them.
Yeah.
Who were we going to believe in? We believed in you, you know, now you just left, you know. And so, and like I say, they didn't mean to do that at all. They were not mad at their fans, you know, but their fans were terribly hurt by that. And all of us were, even the other bands, you know. I just felt so sad, you know, for Bluegrass that the Johnson Mountain Boys would not be playing the festival.
Yeah.
I love for them to do.
And the press release set up this dichotomy between what was left, either the good old boy bar bands or the sticky, sweet, religious, up with people types, which doesn't strike me as
that was just
real.
It was just not thought through, and I think they just they felt embarrassed or bad or something about the JMB breaking up, and they just wanted to put their spin on it, and it was just ill-advised. It wasn't thought through, and you know, Ken would certainly told me that, you know, and I think, you know, if he could rewrite that press release, he would have liked to, and the flack that it stirred up, you know, a lot of people were pissed about the article in the Washington Post, and they didn't like the press release, and everybody was just sort of, you know, kind of irritated by the whole thing, and I'm not sure too much about what good came out of it, but I'll tell you one good thing that came out of it, which is back way later in 1993, which is 5 years later or something like that. Hot Rise was no longer together, but I assembled a band of children, 12-year-olds, including Chris Steele and some other kids of his same age who were great pickers, just great players, who were winning contests and stuff, you know, at the age of 12. And I said these kids should all be put together in one band and play the IBMA, and let everybody know that young people and bluegrass do mix, and here it's happening. And at this time, you know, talking in the year 2000 and going back to 1993, most people cannot even remember that there was a time that people did not already know that. But in the wake of that Washington Post article, which declared that young people are not interested in bluegrass, that was a quote out of that article.
Yeah.
And so I actually, at the awards show at IBMA there in Owensboro, I had to really lobby hard to even have this happen, because the awards show producers didn't want to use up one of the valuable spots on this, you know, nationally broadcast program with a put-together band of kids. Like they said, Jesus, that means we have to turn down one of the veteran bands. And I said, wait till you see the reaction this gets. And after turning down in 92, I lobbied really hard in 93, and they went along. So we put together this little skit where the curtain comes up, and I'm sort of teaching a class of these 12-year-olds, and they're dressed, you know, in ball caps and T-shirts and stuff, unlike everybody else on the awards show. And I'm saying, all right, we're going to teach you some bluegrass. Did everybody do their homework? And they all play a little lick. And then they say, oh, look, there's some microphones. Let's go play a tune. So they get together behind the mics and they play. They just wail through Wheelhouse, which is the Bill Monroe tune. They're playing harmonies with each other. One guy switching instruments, so he plays a hot banjo break and also a hot guitar break. And these are 12-year-olds. Voices haven't changed yet. And these are all. One of them was Michael Cleveland now, who's getting a big reputation as a fiddler now, and he was 13 at the time. And Josh Williams, who's now in the Special Consensus band playing mandolin, he was on banjo in that band, and then of course Chris Steele. So anyway, the audience went bananas, and oh yeah, in the dialogue before they went and played their number, we had a little bit of conversation about how there's this article in the Washington Post says young people aren't interested in bluegrass, and one kid says, "Oh, I'd like to get my hands on that guy," and everybody's chuckling and everything like that. Anyway, that. I don't want to sound like I'm tooting my own horn or patting myself on the back too heavily here, but I'm very proud. I think it's probably the biggest thing I've done, certainly in my career as IBMA president, was to put that right in everybody's face and said, bluegrass for old people, get serious, check this out. The next year, a lot of kids showed up at the IBMA for the first time just to be there. They were playing hooky from school or something. But now there's kids coming from other countries even who could really play their instruments. And the IBMA sort of stepped up their bluegrass in the schools program and trying to reach out to younger people and so on. And somebody, a keynote speaker at IBMA recently referred to, back in '93, that was the year when the focus was on children. And she was wrong. The focus was not on children. The focus was the usual stuff. And this was the one single thing that focused on children, but it made such an impression now that everybody remembers that, I think, as the dawning of